Hello everyone, welcome to our Egyptian online seminar group. First, keep your microphones off. Then, if you have any questions, you can ask our speaker during her presentation or after her presentation. I have great pleasure of welcoming Professor Sarah Bonner. Sarah Bonner is one of the top accounting results leaders in the world. She is a professor of accounting and a professor of management and organization at the Marshall School of Business, University of Southern California. She has published in top-ranking journals in accounting, including Journal of Accounting Research, the Accounting Review, Accounting Organization and Society, and Contemporary Accounting Research, among other journals, and served on a number of editorial boards. Professor Sarah received the American Accounting Association's Outstanding Dissertation Award and the Lifetime Contribution Award from the Accounting Behavior and Organization section of the American Accounting Association. Professor Sarah holds a Ph.D. from the University of Michigan. Now we will start our seminar with Professor Sarah Bonner.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. I really appreciate your inviting me to do this talk. And I think this is a great seminar series that you've started that allows people from anywhere in the world to come on. So I'll say good day because I know that many of you are in the afternoon or evening or even maybe the late night. I decided to talk about expertise today after hearing Robert Nichols' talk in this series a few weeks ago, in which he talked about audit quality being a function of competence and independence. So I decided that perhaps we needed an update on this topic. And expertise is also the key thing I studied early in my career. And I realized the things I've been doing lately could be grouped under this umbrella as well. So I appreciate the opportunity to update myself on the literature and now to see if I can turn this talk into a paper at some point. As Mohammed said, I'm happy to take questions during the presentation. I'd like for people to stay awake, so that would probably be a better way of doing it. If you could simply use the hand raise function, that would make it easier for me to see the questions and get to you in a timely manner. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is whether expertise is an input to judgment and decision making or the output, that is the judgment or the decision. So let's get on the same page with regard to this issue before we start to make things easier to understand. In both psychology and auditing, the literature has described expertise as an input and as an output. So what do we mean by input? This would be one of the many factors affecting individual auditors' task performance, or if you're looking at audit quality from an engagement level, office level, or firm level perspective. So we might say, for example, she brings expertise to her work. If we think of expertise as an output instead, then it would be the actual individual's task performance or the engagement level, office level, firm level, or audit quality. So we might say, for example, she did an expert job on this engagement, if we're talking about individuals. Of course, this brings the question as to how we conceptualize and measure task performance and then audit quality if we're looking at this at a broader level. We know that this opens many cans of worms sometimes. For example, task performance can be thought of as accuracy vis-a-vis some actual outcome. For example, we can compare the auditor's accuracy at giving going concern opinions to eventual bankruptcies of companies. Another way of conceptualizing task performance is conformity with professional standards. And clearly that's of relevance given inspections and reviews. Another way of conceptualizing task performance would be agreement with others, and there are many others as well. In Robert's talk, I think that he mentioned that audit quality has been defined and measured in many ways, and this is the subject of much debate too. I'm not going to get into that today, but we know that that's the case. So for today's talk, to figure out whether to define expertise as an input or an output, I decided to start with the dictionary and the auditing standards. Seems like a pretty good place to start in retrospect. So while I may have defined expertise as an output in a couple of papers, it was a long time ago and I was really young and maybe didn't know what I was talking about. It makes more sense now to think of expertise as an input. So if we look at the dictionary definition, expertise is defined as the skill of an expert, which is not very helpful. So we need to look at the definition of expert, which is a person with the special skill or knowledge representing mastery of a particular subject. So then we look at the auditing standards, and they say the following. The audit is to be performed by a person or persons having adequate technical training and proficiency as an auditor. And also, an auditor should possess the degree of skill commonly possessed by other auditors. How does expertise differ from competence? This is an important question because when Robert talked about audit quality being a function of competence and independence, this is the word that he used. So if we look at the dictionary definition of competence, it's the quality or state of having sufficient knowledge, judgment, or skill. So how do we compare expertise to competence? If we look back up at the definition of expertise, it uses the word mastery, whereas the definition of competence uses the word sufficient. So I think that we can put both of these on a scale from low to high expertise and think of competence versus expertise as simply being a matter of degree, where an expert is one who is a world-class person who has completely mastered a particular subject, whereas a competent person has a very high level of expertise. I just picked some point on the scale, it could be here, that has sufficient knowledge. It's unclear from the auditing standards whether they're talking about expertise or competence. If we look at this terminology, proficiency, and we look up the word proficiency in the dictionary, it has as synonyms both expertise and competence. But when we look at other words in the standards, such as adequate technical training and proficiency, that sounds more like sufficient or competent. Here, the degree of skill commonly possessed by other auditors in the due professional care standard also sounds more like competence. So I'm going to use the words expertise and competence interchangeably today and also think of them as an input, just knowing that things are on a scale. And in research, of course, we're always thinking of things in relative terms, even though the standards use words that are in absolute terms. All right, before we move on to talk about where we are today and what I think some of the interesting issues are, let's just cover a very brief history of the expertise/competence literature. Early on, back in the early 80s, and I know some of you weren't even born then, research tended to designate auditors as experts versus novices, ex ante, and then examined their performance. This was not an unreasonable place to start, as psychology did the same thing. And what the literature found was that auditors thought of as experts did not always outperform those thought of as or designated as novices. The literature also found that auditors thought of as experts did not always perform well from an absolute perspective, which is important given what we just saw in the auditing standards. And we grouped auditors into two buckets of experts and novices as if they were the same within these groups. And of course, there's a great deal of variation in performance within the two groups. So in the late 80s, early 90s, researchers started to examine these mixed results and noticed that the designation of expertise tended to be based on general experience, time as an auditor or time with the firm, or rank, whether someone was a staff or a senior or a manager, for example. And based on thinking about these issues, researchers recognized several things. The first was in Frederick and Libby. And they noted that you need to consider what specific knowledge is needed for a task, and at what point in an auditor's time with the firm this knowledge would be acquired, as opposed to assuming that people at a certain level have certain knowledge, right? And you note that when Frederick and Libby talked about the issues this way, they were equating expertise or competence with knowledge. Again, that's not unreasonable because it's sitting right in the definition of expertise. In my dissertation, the next thing that the literature thought about was we also have to consider which components of the task would be most aided by knowledge acquired by experience, and whether experience is even necessary to acquire that knowledge, or whether it can be learned through training. So in the first paper from my dissertation, I showed that knowledge gained from experience likely is important in selecting the information that's relevant to performing a task and weighting that information properly. In the second paper, though, I showed that for certain tasks, not all tasks, of course, that people may acquire knowledge about how to evaluate cues or information through training, through formal training. So they may not need a great deal of experience to perform that component of the task. Another thing that researchers recognized is that task characteristics can come into play. So Abdulmohammadi and Wright talked about the importance of considering task complexity and mentioned that some of these studies above may have found no effects of experience because tasks were very simple, in which case perhaps everyone had the knowledge, no matter how experienced they were, or alternatively very complex, in which case very few people had the knowledge, irrespective of their level of general experience. The next thing that happened in the literature was Bonner and Lewis. And in this paper, what we noted was that people who have the same level of general experience have different specific experiences as well as different specific training. So people who are managers or seniors can end up with different knowledge. And in retrospect, this may seem obvious. For example, industry specialists have different knowledge. People specialize in different industries, but until that point, it hadn't been recognized. We also recognized, that's related to this, that there are multiple types of knowledge that people have, and I'll get to the types of knowledge shortly. In addition, Bonner and Lewis and Libby and Luft, among other papers, pointed out that there are other person-related factors besides those gained through experience that affect task performance, such as ability and motivation. And so these are going to contribute to performance or the output of a judgment and decision-making task. Now, having said that, we also need to recognize that things like ability and motivation can vary with experience as well, due to firm selection biases. So for example, perhaps firms only promote people to senior or manager who are the most motivated and or the most able. So if we use experience as a proxy for expertise, then we may be capturing those other characteristics of individuals as well, besides knowledge. And then finally, in Bonner and Pennington, we wrote about the importance of cognitive processing to task performance in addition to knowledge. And this general idea that expertise encompasses both knowledge and processing is the one that I'd like to return to today. So the bottom line then, if we're defining expertise, we could say that someone with high expertise in auditing would have high quality knowledge, whatever's relevant to a particular task, and also would use high quality processing rather than just having knowledge, which is where we started. All right, so it's this idea that's going to lead the rest of what I talk about today. We've had a lot of research that show that both knowledge and cognitive processing matter, which I'll summarize shortly. But again, first let's look at the definitions. and what the auditing standards have to say about this. So knowledge is defined as the understanding of facts or ideas acquired by study, investigation, observation, or experience. Or we can also think of it as simply information stored in long-term memory. Note that part of knowledge's definition is based on how it's acquired through study, observation, experience, etc. And we'll come back to this point. Cognitive processing is not in the dictionary, so I just used a definition from psychology. Cognitive processing can be defined simply as the set of mental operations or activities someone performs or engages in to make a judgment or decision. Let's see if the auditing standards talk about both knowledge and processing. So going back to the most fundamental standard, 1001, it says the professional qualifications required of the independent auditor are those of the person with the education and experience to practice as such. This implies knowledge because it's talking about the factors that lead to the acquisition of knowledge, like in the definition. And then it says, in the observance of the standards, the independent auditor must exercise his judgment. This implies that the auditor has to process information. In 1010, it also says the attainment of that proficiency begins with formal education and extends into subsequent experience, again, implying that knowledge is important. And then it says he must study, understand, and apply. So apply indicates that the auditor is processing information. This standard also specifies a particular type of knowledge, which is new pronouncements. So it's saying that the auditor must have knowledge and must have knowledge that is up to date as well. And then finally, the standard on due professional care really talks a lot about processing. It says the matter of due professional care concerns what the independent auditor does and how well he or she does it. An auditor should exercise it, referring to skill or knowledge, with reasonable care and diligence. That is, the auditor should engage in cognitive processing in a manner that shows due professional care.
Sarah, excuse me, I have a question.
Sure.
I'm Dina Al-Mahdi from Morgan State University in Baltimore. Nice meeting you here.
Hi, Dina.
Hi. So I don't do audit research, but I always control for audit quality, at least Big Four in my archival research. And I was wondering, can we make the assumption that audit expertise always on the rise? In other words, like post-audit engagement, the audit expertise would be higher pre any audit engagement?
Are you asking whether we can assume that that's the case for the Big Four versus other firms?
I would expect it to be on all kind of audits. Of course, when it comes to Big Four, they have more tools, more expertise, more resources. They engage with bigger firm, with more complexity. The firm itself has more resources. So I would expect it to be a little bit higher in Big Four.
Yes, well, I don't know the audit quality literature very well, but I think that that's one of the controls that's commonly used. I'm talking about this more at the individual level, and I know that there are some archival studies recently that have been able to obtain data about the partner and controlled for either partner individual characteristics or partner fixed effects, and shown that the partner matters in addition to the office as and the firm. I'm not sure in those studies whether they controlled for firm or whether they just controlled for office. So my focus generally is going to be on the individual, but at the end, I will talk about the issue of engagement level expertise, because you're absolutely right that it's the pooled knowledge of an engagement team that matters ultimately to the audit quality at the engagement level. Now, going beyond that, I don't want to get into what matters to knowledge and expertise so much at the office or the firm level, because I don't know as much about that particular topic. That's more of an economics archival literature domain of research. Does that answer your question, Dina?
Yes, thank you so much.
Sure. Okay. So let's talk about why knowledge is important in auditing? Why is it important to task performance and audit quality? This is incredibly obvious, but I felt like it's important to just say this out loud. Without knowledge, auditors would have to acquire all the information they need for a given audit from scratch, rather than just the current year's client-related information. That is, having knowledge that's stored in your head is incredibly important, because you would have to do this over and over and over. And audits would never get done on time if they were to meet standards, or if they're done on time, they would not meet standards. And the consequence of that could be material misstatements galore, unless management has incentives to and does prevent or catch and fix material misstatements. And of course, specialized knowledge has always been thought in the sociology literature to be the hallmark of a profession, one of the indicators of a profession. So consistent with this, of course, in auditing, there's been lots of research since the early 90s, both experimental and archival, that show that multiple facets and knowledge matter to individual auditors' performance of task or to audit quality. Again, the archival work typically is going to look at this at the firm level or the office level, or even the firm level, as Dina was mentioning. So much of this research shows just what psychology and other fields show about people in general, which may not seem all that interesting today, that knowledge matters, but we first needed to establish that auditors are people too. After that, we could look at issues that are specific to auditing, not necessarily unique, as other professions require multiple forms of knowledge and extensive knowledge as well. But perhaps what is most unique about auditing is how people acquire knowledge, which is under very difficult conditions, as it turns out. And we don't know much about this currently, so that's going to be one of the things I'll talk about shortly. So what types of technical knowledge matter? If we look at the standard's not very clear. It says the engagement partner on whom the audit rests should know at a minimum the relevant professional accounting and auditing standards and be knowledgeable about the client. So the standard recognizes that client-specific knowledge is important, and we can infer this somewhat from the archival papers that are about audit tenure and partner rotation and firm rotation. But the independence issue comes in as well with these papers, so we really don't know that much. I've mentioned a couple of archival papers that I found recently trying to look more specifically at client-specific knowledge or expertise. This is obviously virtually impossible to do experimentally. So experimental papers have looked more at task-specific and industry knowledge. Task-specific knowledge, for example, an auditor who's auditing goodwill needs to know about goodwill accounting, as well as the standard on how to audit estimates. People are still interested in this. I saw an archival piece in TAR recently about the importance of fair value knowledge. Of course, this was not at the individual level, again, because it's hard to get those data archivally. In the industry knowledge area, we have a ton of archival information about the importance of industry knowledge. Again, typically at the office level based on market share. But we have experiments showing that individual auditors' industry knowledge matters as well. Going back to the archival literature, using market share to capture industry knowledge at the office level, Robert Neckel and Devin Williams have a very interesting paper, working paper, that considers how industry knowledge is actually acquired at the office level, and whether market share actually captures that knowledge acquisition process. So instead, for example, they think about things like whether an auditor can meet with a specialist from another office who can easily fly in, or that auditor can easily fly out to meet with that specialist. And this is it's a really great example of thinking very clearly about where that knowledge is going to come from and how archivalists might use measures that capture where the knowledge comes from. Clearly, there are other types of technical knowledge that might matter. For example, IT knowledge, general business knowledge. Then we have research on tacit job knowledge, which I won't talk about today. I'll focus just on technical knowledge. All right, so which facets of knowledge matter? We can think about knowledge as having two dimensions, content and structure. So knowledge content refers to the quantity and specific pieces of information that are stored in long-term memory, including, of course, whether it's relevant to the task at hand. So again, why does knowledge content help? The auditor doesn't have to reacquire information every time it's needed, and retrieval from memory generally is faster than searching for information, even Googling it. The only exception to that might be if you're old and memory retrieval is a little bit more challenging. Knowledge structure refers to the extent to which and the ways in which knowledge is organized in memory. Psychologists have shown us that knowledge is not just thrown in our heads randomly, like in a garbage can. It's organized around meaningful dimensions. And how this helps us, including auditors, is that when you remember one item, you're also going to remember other items that are relevant because they're connected to that first item. And a process called spreading activation makes you remember those other items as well. So for example, if you think about cats, you'll likely think about dogs and other domestic pets, such as goldfish. If you think about one sales authorization control, you likely think of others, which can be very helpful to you when you're trying to determine the quality of controls over that particular objective. So if knowledge and content and structure are so important, why might they not help? Well, the most obvious reason is that knowledge is not complete as to content and structure, or in other words, it's not at a competent level, which is what we would expect of partners. So below partners, we have people who are still learning. Auditors at all levels have to learn to do their task initially, and this takes time. But let's set that aside for a moment and assume that auditors have ample time to learn. The learning conditions may not be optimal, right? They may not be the best if learning were the sole objective. I'll come back to this in more detail, but as an example, seniors coaching staff may be dog tired. All right, further, there's a rapidly evolving world and there's a lot of stuff to learn in the first place and keep up with. Okay, finally, if knowledge structure is complete, processing, including memory retrieval, can be off in some way. All right, I would be remiss, and some of you are saying, and what about the fact that we have all these mechanisms in auditing that are meant to compensate for knowledge not being complete below the partner level? We have the review process, right? So staff, seniors work under the supervision and review of more experienced individuals. We have the staffing process. Team members should be assigned to tasks commensurate with their level of knowledge. And we have inputs from key players, core team members, people who are involved in testing controls. We have specialists, etc. I'll return to this at the end. Okay, so let me get to the meat of my talk about knowledge. How do individuals acquire knowledge? If knowledge is important, then we need to think about how it's acquired or how people learn. We know that generally people, including auditors, acquire knowledge through instruction and experience. And experience is particularly important in auditing. If you look at this graphic from PwC, all of the things that they talk about here, learning from others and learning by doing, occur through experience. Whereas formal learning or instruction, they believe to constitute only a small amount of the learning or the forum in which learning occurs for auditors. Westerman et al. Have a great paper where they also interview people and talk about how much of staff learning at least occurs on the job, which would be through experience. So what does experience include? Learning from others includes a lot of things, okay? These first several things here are learning from others, asking questions of peers, superiors, clients, specialists, receiving coaching, receiving feedback in the review process, observing and listening to others. Another thing that's important is using firm resources. Firms have vast resources, And it would be nice to know how auditors learned from those resources, or what elements of those resources can impede learning, such as the length of a checklist. The one that I'm going to focus on today is doing tasks, all right? Consistent with what PwC says and what Westerman et al. Say, doing tasks has got to be one of the biggest ways in which people learn, okay? Taking this a step further, auditors, when doing audit tasks, typically have prior year work papers as a reference, and they can learn from these work papers by reading them and trying to figure out what last year's preparer did. The paper I'm going to talk about in a minute looks at this, and I was really quite surprised when writing up that paper that there's no research on learning by doing at the individual level, and especially learning while using prior year work papers as a reference. This is incredibly important in practice. All right, so before we get to the specific research, let's talk about what the issues are with auditors' learning environments not being optimal. In the psych literature, knowledge is thought to be best acquired through a combination of instruction, practice, and feedback that is accurate, immediate, and complete. For the highest level of knowledge, practice is structured in certain ways. It's given ample time. Tasks are sequenced based on knowledge building blocks. For example, we teach students about assets and liabilities before we teach them about revenues and expenses, because the definition of revenues and expenses includes assets and liabilities. And the best practice would be that instruction and experience is accompanied by on-the-spot coaching as well. So we can easily see right off the bat that auditing's not necessarily set up as a pristine, optimal learning environment. That is, the audit is done to perform an engagement and give an opinion on a client's financial statements. The primary objective of an audit is not to provide a learning laboratory for people, even though firms recognize the importance of training their individuals and spend probably billions of dollars on training. And they also recognize the importance of coaching, supervision, the review process, and so forth. But the doing of the task has some issues. So for example, people work under time and deadline pressures, so there may not be adequate time to learn while doing their task. Auditors have pressures from multiple constituents, including the client and regulators. So for example, while doing tasks, auditors may focus on documentation for the PCAOB, which takes time and attention away from the core of the audit, and auditors have expressed concern about this. We have geographically dispersed teams, so the superior may not be right there to do on-the-spot coaching. We have a number of other issues. The one that I'm going to focus on is that the learning materials, in other words, prior year work papers for the most part, that are not primarily meant to serve as learning materials, actually do serve as learning materials. However, auditors understand that the purpose of work papers is to document work, okay? And also the work papers may convey other information to auditors depending on how they're set up. So for example, Tracy Majors and Stacy Ritter and I have a 2018 paper that looks at whether work papers are pre-populated with the prior year conclusions and evidence. And one inference that auditors draw from work papers being pre-populated is that the audit values efficiency. So if auditors are learning primarily from doing, which means using work papers while they're doing a task, then we have to consider that characteristics of the work papers themselves can affect learning. Pre-population, for example, may lighten the load that auditors have because the information is sitting right in front of them. However, if they also infer from the setup of those work papers that efficiency is important, they may work too fast to learn much. So if you look at the literature, we have a lot of research on many of these topics, including today we have research on technology. But what this research looks at is the effects of many of these variables on auditors' performance. That, of course, completely makes sense because an audit is done for performance purposes, first and foremost, not for learning. Okay, so before I get to talk about my current work, let's just briefly look at research on individual auditors' acquisition of knowledge or learning. There's very little work that directly addresses auditors' acquisition of knowledge, specifically acquisition of knowledge that includes some sort of doing of task, practice, and feedback. So these are some of the studies, and you can look at them. This one is great because it looks at learning from a decision aid, which I think we need more of, because decision aids and those sorts of resources are ubiquitous in practice, and they're meant, I'm sure, not only to facilitate performance, but to facilitate learning. The most important point that I want to make, though, is that we can't assume that key elements like time pressure, pressure from the PCAOB, et cetera, affect learning or the acquisition of knowledge in the same way that they affect task performance. Instead, if we want to think about how auditors acquire knowledge, which again is incredibly important if it's a key input to audit quality, we have to develop predictions based on learning theories. So going back to my example of pre-populated work papers, in addition to inferring from pre-population that efficiency is important, which would hurt both accuracy and learning, we would expect. So the effects on accuracy and learning would go the same way in that case. Auditors may also infer that it is acceptable to stick with last year's conclusions. This could help accuracy if things haven't changed much from the prior year. But if you think about it, this could hurt learning because people simply stick with last year and don't take the time to consider very much about the facts of the case. So in other words, they may not learn very much. All right, so my bottom line point here about learning is we really need a lot more research on knowledge acquisition, especially on the most common mechanisms through which it occurs, which is on the job by doing task. And along with that, how key elements of the audit environment affect learning through those mechanisms. For example, the characteristics of prior year work papers, among others. All right, so with that lead up, of course, I'm going to talk about a paper with Tracy Majors that looks at just these issues. Here, what we do is we examine auditors' acquisition of knowledge while performing a risk assessment task, that is, as a byproduct of doing the task, while they're using prior year work papers. And the research question we look at in the study is whether the formality of the documentation in those prior year work papers negatively affects acquisition of knowledge about risk. So here's what we did. We gave auditors documentation in this risk assessment task about a variety of risk factors that was either formal or less formal. And they use this as part of performing the current year risk assessment. So you can see right off the bat that formal and less formal are different in a variety of ways. Formal includes unnecessary as well as technical words. It has no abbreviations, whereas there are abbreviations in the less formal, and it's very rigid as to grammar and presentation. So auditors performed the risk assessment task, and then after that, we ask them knowledge questions. They aren't informed that these are coming. So for example, with regard to this factor, competence and objectivity of internal audit, we asked them what factors would decrease the risk of material misstatement due to internal audit competence. And we expected them to think about things like auditors having degrees, continuing education, et cetera. And then we graded their answers just like you would grade a test. So why did we look at knowledge acquisition while performing a task? I've said this again, but it bears repeating. This is a primary way in which auditors learn, it appears, based on the limited information we have already. And why would this be the primary way in which auditors learn, staff especially? Their superiors are busy and depleted. So seniors have their own tasks, distractions, long hours. Their superiors may not be there in person. We have geographical disbursement or remote working. As another example, staff may feel concerned about asking clients questions in order to gain knowledge because of status differentials. Bennett and Hatfield have a great paper about this. Why did we look at learning with the aid of prior year work papers? Again, because this is almost always the case. So this means that work papers are a key learning material that auditors have, whether they're meant to be a learning material or not. Okay, so we can conceptualize work papers in terms of learning materials, even though they aren't set up to be that way in a pristine learning lab with perfect materials. Specifically, prior year work papers can be thought of as a combination of worked examples and textbooks. And we can use learning theories that apply to these specific learning materials to make hypotheses about how characteristics of prior year work papers might affect auditors' knowledge acquisition. So why do we look at formality? Of all the characteristics of work papers that we could choose, we chose this because of all the concern about PCAOB inspectors forcing or expecting auditors to use a very formal style in their work papers to satisfy documentation requirements. Yet, there still can be variation in formality based on individual differences. I don't have the chat in front of me, but I see now there are several things in the chat. Perhaps I should stop at this point and see where we are. Okay, can this research apply to internal auditors as well? I believe absolutely it can. They should be learning from the same sorts of mechanisms, but perhaps there are some interesting mechanisms that internal auditors have that external auditors don't. How can auditor expertise affect the level of professional skepticism? That's a very loaded question. It depends on how you characterize professional skepticism. In my way of thinking about professional skepticism, it is using the proper cognitive processes, which I will come to shortly. But others think of professional skepticism as an attitude that influences the use of knowledge and processing. So I think that we still have a lot to debate and think about from that perspective. It's an excellent question. I was worried that someone was going to ask it. What's the reason of, there we go, professional skepticism. So that's very similar. Okay, Tim, you have a question.
Hi, thank you. I want to play the devil's advocate on your current study and ask, are you measuring information or knowledge acquisition, or are you measuring information retrieval?
Well, information retrieval, you mean from short-term memory?
Exactly. You know, so before we go to sleep and store it with everything else that's applicable.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say that we are capturing at least some knowledge as opposed to information retrieved from short-term memory, without getting into the details of the study, because I do want to talk about processing as well. I can tell you that they had a large number of questions. They had a large amount of work to do. And if we think about the amount of information that can be stored in short-term memory, there's no way that they could have answered all of these questions using only short-term memory. Moreover, I would suggest that much of short-term memory had been cleared by the time they got to these questions simply by going through multiple risk factors. It absolutely may be the case, Tim, that say the last risk factor they looked at, if they happen to get a question on that right after they looked at it, that could reflect short-term memory. And that's a really great point that we could look at in analyses. We could look at what was the last risk factor they actually made an assessment of, and then in what order did they receive the questions to rule out the short-term memory issue. And my co-author, Tracy, is on today. Hey, Tracy. So I hope you're writing this down, Tracy, because that's an additional analysis we could do. Thank you very much, Tim.
Okay, so the task was done in such a way that you can figure out what they looked at first, second, third, so on and so forth.
I think that we can. I think that we can. I'm not going to promise 100%, but I think that, well, you know what? I don't know exactly how we set up Qualtrics to randomize them. So I would have to go back and see if we actually can do that.
Gosh, and
if we can, then we could do that analysis.
Understood. Another just quick observation. We talked before about performance being a function of ability and motivation. Yes. Do we believe that would also be the case for knowledge acquisition? It's just your raw ability or intellect, and your motivation to learn would also affect this?
Absolutely. And so part of the problem in this area is that ability and motivation also affect acquisition of knowledge as well as task performance. So it's very difficult, especially if you use performance or experience or some other proxy for knowledge, that you're picking up these other types of things. So in this particular study, we did take some measures that were meant to proxy for ability and motivation and controlled for them, and they don't change the results. Okay, so okay, all right, you gave me the thumbs up. Thanks, Tim. All right, so why formality? Practitioners have expressed concerns about the effects of this formal PCAOB-driven style of documenting things affecting learning as well as performance, especially when it's extreme. And again, appealing to learning theory, if we were to think of an audit engagement as being set up to be a pristine learning laboratory, extreme formality would not be found in materials that were set up intentionally to be learning materials. For example, psychology research shows that people learn more from concise text and worked examples. Okay, so getting to the findings of this study. So what we did was we appealed to learning theories on text and worked examples and saw that there are two key processes that mediate acquisition of knowledge from these types of materials: attention to relevant information and self-explanation of relevant information, that is, trying to figure out what the auditor did last year. And we predict that auditors are going to learn less from formal documentation for a couple of reasons. The first is simply because of the style features that can detract from attention to relevant information. So for example, auditors might just get lost in all the unnecessary words. We also predict, though, that these work papers and their setup carry meaning, and that auditors will make an inference about the setup. So if they see formal documentation, they may infer that that reflects a team's concern about a PCAOB inspection. So while that may have some positive effects on learning, that is, they'll self-explain more in order to perform well or accurately, they also end up spending some of their limited attention and processing capacity on inspection-related matters, documentation, for example, and other inspection-related matters that are not relevant to learning, and that this will impede learning. So our findings, I'm just giving you the means here, are that auditors do learn less with more formal documentation, and attention and self-explanation do appear to be the mediators. Okay, let's see. One more question in the chat. Anil, yes, the slides will be part of the YouTube video that Mohammed will post. Okay, so let's move on then and talk about processing in our remaining time. Okay, so just like with knowledge, I'm asserting that cognitive processing is a key component of expertise or competence. So why is processing important? Well, again, this is incredibly obvious, but it's important to say. If we think about, say, chess masters or chess experts who store thousands of patterns of chessboards in their memories, they can simply match to a pattern on the board, and then that tells them what move to make next. Auditors can't do this. They can't just retrieve an answer from memory to perform a given audit task. And that's because they're giving an opinion on the current year's financial statements. So they must obtain and process information outside their memories about current year risk, transactions, et cetera, in addition to using their knowledge, of course. In other words, every audit is new or unique. So there's a variety of stages of processing that matter: memory retrieval, information search, looking for information outside of memory, information evaluation, weighting and combination, measuring and putting information together based on its diagnosticity. Which facets of processing matter? Well, generally it's accuracy and completeness, just as we would expect. And we have early research showing that auditors, for example, use heuristics and exhibit confirmation bias. And these process characteristics negatively affect performance because they negatively affect memory retrieval and information search at a minimum. More recent research has shown that auditors engage in motivated reasoning, superficially process information, and do not fully integrate it. And these processes are also biased and incomplete, so they can have a negative effect on task performance. So if auditors use biased and incomplete processes, and that's an important part of expertise, what leads auditors to use these processes? Surprisingly, we really don't know too much other than what we know from psychology, which is that auditors are boundedly rational like others. They have short-term memory limitations and they're slow processors. And processing like heuristics is based on these two characteristics of bounded rationality. So again, we know that auditors are human. Some recent studies have shown us that perhaps processing is a function of personal characteristics. So Griffith, Caduce, and Young have a paper that show that need for cognition comes into play. We also have various studies that look at characteristics of the audit environment or interventions which go along with this, that would suggest to us that factors like accountability and incentives that lead to motivation can change the processes auditors use for the better, at least temporarily. And we've had several papers look at whether judgment frameworks do this as well. But what about audit-specific factors? So going back to knowledge, we had a nice long list of factors that we could speculate might affect the acquisition of knowledge, even though those effects hadn't been looked at. They'd just been looked at on performance. So many of those, like depletion, would come back here too, and likely affect how auditors process. The one I want to talk about, of course, though, is one that I have a paper on because it's easier for me to remember that, is the fact that auditors tend to work in a similar type of context across time and across clients, the typical audit room. Okay? And in turn, their cognitive processing can become tied to and triggered by the context rather than by what they should be doing. Abdallah, I'll come back to your question later once we get to the end so I can finish up what I want to talk about with processing. All right, so the idea here is that processing is dictated by the context in which auditors find themselves rather than by what they should be doing, which is their goals and their task demands. So in this vein, I want to talk about a paper that Catherine Caduce and Tracy Majors and I have that's conditionally accepted in the Accounting Review that examines auditors' use of simple cognitive processes, ones that are not necessarily complete and accurate, when auditing a complex estimate that requires or demands the use of more complex processes, ones that are more complete and less biased, in order to achieve the best performance on this task. The research question that we look at is whether the strength of habits that auditors possess, senior auditors, affects their use of these processes. So let's define what a habit is, because we hear this word in normal conversation, but it's good to have a precise definition. A habit is an association in one's mind between a context, okay, which is typically a place, including surrounding people, possibly, and a behavior. Here we're talking about cognitive behaviors that develops with the repetition of that behavior in that context, as well as concurrent rewards. So the behavior originally occurs to satisfy a specific goal, but then becomes triggered by the context rather than by the current goal or the task demands. So the example that's given in the psychology literature most frequently is the popcorn example. So people go to the movies and they go when they're hungry, and they may buy popcorn because they're hungry. So they're trying to satisfy a goal of being less hungry. But over time, if they eat and enjoy popcorn at the movies, they may eventually buy and eat popcorn simply because they are in a movie theater, not because they're hungry. For example, they just had dinner and they're now eating popcorn again. So in other words, the behavior is triggered by the context rather than by the goal which initially triggered it. The goal falls away. So in auditing, the context that we're talking about is what we call the typical audit room. And this is the picture that we gave auditors to get them to think about being in that audit room. And the behavior, as I said, is a cognitive behavior. It's the use of superficial processing, not in-depth processing, confirmatory rather than unbiased processing, and piecemeal processing rather than integrating things together as one needs to do when auditing a complex estimate. So we look at this processing as evidenced by the number of issues they identify, because if they engage in such processing, they will identify fewer issues with a complex estimate. So why do we look at the use of simple processes? I've just said it. Regulators in prior research identify this as a key cause of deficiencies in audits of estimates. So we knew that processing matters. Now we're looking at where it might be coming from. What is the root cause of this processing? So we consider the strength of habits. Why? Auditors work under conditions that are strongly conducive to the formation of habits. So what do I mean by that? In particular, when they're staff, back when they were staff, seniors likely repeatedly used, I should say, simple cognitive processes because their work as staff included simple tasks such as vouching. Why would staff use these processes? Because they're effective for those simple tasks, and they're also quite efficient. So it helps them achieve the goals of auditing, and they may also feel rewarded by praise for accomplishing both goals, in particular for being quite efficient. More important, staff use these processes in a context, that room, that is stable over time and across clients. So again, the general idea is that the simple processes can be tied in their mind to being in an audit room as opposed to being dictated by the task that they're doing. We know anecdotally that habits are hard to break, right? If any of us have bad habits and we've tried to break them, they're very hard to break. So we posit that staff moving to the senior level carry with them these habits, all right? However, seniors now have different tasks. So their cognitive processing should be dictated by the task rather than the context, but they're still sitting in the same context, in the same audit room, okay? We recognize, though, that the strength of their habits is going to vary based on what they did as staff. So some staff have more exposure to simple tasks than others. Some are more likely to use simple processes than others. Okay, for example, those with a lower need for cognition might. We don't measure that, but that's one hypothesis. And the extent to which they're concerned about receiving praise. Okay, so there's variance in habit strength. The way we measured habit strength was by looking at how quickly auditors completed these word fragments that reflect simple processes, such as glance, scan, skim, etc. We use control word fragments to subtract out speeds because some people simply type or recognize words more quickly than others. Finally, we examine the context that auditors are working in. We manipulate this in order to validate that we're capturing habits. We do several other things to validate our habit strength measure as well, but there's not time to talk about those. So what we predict is if you have strong habits and you're sitting in the context in which you develop those habits, you're going to do worse at identifying issues with a complex estimate than if you have weaker habits. Okay, the people who didn't tie their processing to the context that strongly in the first place. And also, if you have strong habits and we move you to a different context, then the context is less likely to trigger that processing, and you should do better than if you're sitting in the audit room where you originally developed those processes. So again, I'm just giving you the descriptives here. You can see in the typical audit room that auditors with stronger habits to use simple processes indeed identify fewer issues than those with weaker habits. Then when we move we put people with stronger habits, we don't do this within subjects, so I'm speaking a little bit loosely. When we put them in the alternative audit context, they identify more issues. And we posit this is because now they're thinking about the tasks they're doing rather than letting context drive their processing. I see it's 9, but let me just take a couple of minutes to finish up my last couple of slides here. So another thing that I wanted to mention is knowledge and cognitive processing have separate effects that we've talked about. We know that they're both important to task performance and likely to audit quality. What about their joint effects? We know very little here. So for example, can lack of knowledge be compensated for by good processing? This seems pretty unlikely given what we said before. For example, could someone search for all the information they don't know and still perform well? Well, there's not enough time to do this. That's why we said having knowledge in your head is super important. All right. Further, you may need knowledge to know what to look for to best guide your information search and evaluation. Let's take the other example. Can poor processing be compensated for by knowledge? This seems even less likely to me. And in fact, the combination of high knowledge and lower quality processing could be a very bad thing. Think about motivated reasoning, for example. Who might be the best or worst, depending on your perspective, at motivated reasoning? It's people who have a lot of knowledge. And this is particularly worrisome to me, given that many of the remedies firms have put in place to deal with processing issues like judgment frameworks are meant to be dealing with motivated reasoning. And they also tend to be used by more knowledgeable auditors, seniors, because those frameworks are being used for complex tasks. So it's possible that these judgment frameworks are being given to people who are in the best position to get around them if they so desire. When thinking about this, it reminded me of a really cool paper that Steve Katchmeyer and Bill Messier had in 1990 about how auditors get around sampling decision aids based on their motivation to end up with a small sample size. I don't think we really have any research about this, and I think it's a really interesting topic. All right, finally, going back to sort of where we started, I've talked about individual knowledge and processing, and I noted on an early slide that this is assuming that issues with individuals' knowledge and processing are not compensated for in some other way. Another way of saying this is ultimately it's the collective expertise or competence of the team that matters to engagement level audit quality. And the extent to which knowledge at the team level is brought to bear and processed properly. Sorry, I forgot to move my slide. depends on many, many things. And we have interesting and recent research on many of these. So for example, the collective expertise depends on the efficacy of staffing, as we saw in the standard. We don't know much about this. Doug Prod had a cool paper about this back in the 90s, but I haven't seen much recently. We can infer from studies about how auditors judge others' competence generally that this might extend to staffing and task assignment processes, but it would be good to know that for sure. The collective expertise of the team also depends on the efficacy of the review and supervision processes. We have tons of research about the review process, how preparers stylize work papers, how reviewers react to this, what types of errors reviewers find, how the way in which the review is done, electronic versus face-to-face, affects the quality of the review. These are all very important studies. Another factor that affects the collective expertise is the extent to which team members share their knowledge and knowledge is properly used. So here we can go back to Ken Trotman's pioneering work on the group process back in the 80s to today's work on brainstorming that's required by the standard on fraud. Beyond this, Chad Praw and co-authors also have several papers about factors that affect staff willingness to raise various issues, which I think is very important, a very important line of research, because this hasn't been examined before and staff are on the front lines and they find things. And if they're not willing or they're too scared to raise those things to the team level, then the team level expertise suffers. Relatedly, the efficacy or the extent to which expertise of the team is brought to bear in the audit depends on the extent to which team members and specialists seek out knowledge from each other, then properly use it. We also have a number of interesting recent papers in these areas, especially with specialists. We have many people working in these areas: Tim Bauer, Cassandra Estep, Emily Griffith, Robert Neckel and Justin Labey have an interesting paper recently in JAR. So people are working on all of these things, and they're really important things to think about, given that it's the team level expertise that matters. So I would encourage doing this research more. Okay, I'm 7 minutes over, but now we have time for questions. Let's see, let me go back to the chat first. Abdallah, are you talking about, Abdallah, are you talking about entering the audit profession with no industry experience? Maybe Abdallah is not there. Okay, let's go ahead. Who else has a question?
If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. If anyone have any questions, you can, you can ask.
Hello, from Kuwait.
Hello.
I have a question. When you analyze the audit firms as their expertise is developing, for example, did you check in what type of places they are doing the trainings, for example? And at least in Turkey, there is a amount of time that the audit office must provide to its audit seniors and juniors. So that will be based on the governance, bookkeeping, the management, and so on. But as your research is very specific, did you check, for example, in what type of places these junior auditors and senior auditors are taking the training? Because if it is a very small room, if it is not really suitable in terms of getting some training, no computers, no proper air conditions, so on, although that training will be written as a training to the SEC or PCAOB, it will not be a real training because people will not get any benefit of it.
That's a really, really, really interesting question. In the US, of course, I'm sure you know the big firms have their training centers, right? Many of them have developed their own training centers, and a lot of the training does occur in those centers. But you're right, some of it still does occur in the office. And there are many factors that could come into play that could affect the acquisition of knowledge in either of those places, right? For example, maybe there's more peer pressure in the office that would offset what you're talking about because the class is being taught by someone who's your supervisor. I don't think we know anything about this. Unfortunately, a lot of the literature about training is in education journals because people have studied how best, say, to teach students auditing. And this literature doesn't get the attention that I think it deserves. Certainly from the firm's perspective, right? As you say, they're making choices about how to train their auditors, where to train their auditors, how much time to give, et cetera. A lot of the time component of it probably is dictated by regulations on continuing education. But again, we know that the large firms go well beyond what's required by continuing education. So I have not looked at this, but I think it's a very interesting question.
Because we have a working paper related, and not with the size of the training offices, but with the timing of the trainings that the auditors are getting, and it is positively affecting the audit quality. If you want, I can share the working paper with you.
That would be great if you could email it to me. Another thing that I thought about when you mentioned that was, do they do their training in the morning or the afternoon, right?
Yes. Yes.
So there are lots of factors that could come into play. Okay,
Thank
who
you so
else?
much.
Sure. What other questions do you have?
If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Anil?
Yes, sir. I wanted to know how the big four audit companies do classification shifting. In India,
I think that's well beyond my expertise, Anil.
Okay.
Thank you for the question, but that's not something that I know much about. It's a very interesting topic. I agree.
If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Bassam?
Yes, thank you, Professor. I would like to ask if you recommend any studies which link auditor expertise with auditor professional skepticism.
I can't think of anything off the top of my head, and my colleagues are here and remember something else that directly does that. Please correct me. I think it's a really, really important topic because professional skepticism is in the standards. It's very unclear from the standards. When I teach my auditing students, they always say, what does professional skepticism mean? And of course, we've had a lot of papers that have tried to define what professional skepticism means. As I said earlier, the way that I think of professional skepticism, but this is just my personal opinion, is that professional skepticism means thinking properly for the task at hand. But others have different definitions of professional skepticism, such as an attitude that the auditor brings to the task, which then can influence what they do. I would think of it simply as the processing per se. Okay. So some of this, Bassam, is definitional, it's conceptual, but I maybe what you're asking is, have people used, for example, trait skepticism scales and yes, correlated those with knowledge? Not to my knowledge, but I think that's a really interesting idea again.
Yes, I will try to look at this maybe later. Thank you.
Are there another question? If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question.
I see Devin is here. Devin, I shouted out to you.
Thank you for that.
Sure, it's a good paper.
Is there another question? Professor Tariq?
Yes, please. Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for this interesting presentation.
Sure.
Actually, this is an interesting topic, actually. I would like to ask about the personal characteristics of auditor, such as the gender, for example. Do you think that one may affect the acquisition of knowledge? Another point also, you speak about the work. What do you think about the impact of COVID-19 and working remotely? This also may affect, in your opinion, the acquisition of knowledge?
Those are really great questions. I don't know what the psychology literature says about gender and learning. That's something that I would have to look up. generally, like the previous question asked, the learning literature is going to look at ability and motivation being two key components of learning. So if gender were to proxy for one of those, then we might see gender effects were we to simply measure gender rather than measuring the underlying characteristics of ability and motivation. With regard to remote working, my co-author Catherine actually presented our habits paper to the PCAOB, and that was one of the questions that she got with regard to processing. You're asking about with regard to knowledge. It's really unclear because everyone's going to be in their own setting. And so their knowledge acquisition, I think, is going to be a function of how distracted they are in their own setting, how tired they are in their own setting. Their ability should be the same. Perhaps their motivation is different. It's kind of hard to say. So it seems like there are some characteristics of remote work that might help learning, but some that also might hurt learning. So it's a very interesting question. And I know a lot of people are interested in this. One thing I want to say at this point is I realized I kept talking about the next slide without advancing my slides. I apologize for that. Eventually I caught on and advanced my slides because I'm looking at my notes on the screen rather than looking at what you're seeing. So it wasn't the most expert presentation, that's for sure. Other questions?
Are there another question? If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Thank you very much, dear Professor Sarah, for your contribution and your effort. It's really an excellent presentation. Thank you very much. So all that remains for me to say is thank you everyone that joined us, and I thank you very much for taking the time out to present to us today, dear Professor Sarah. It is been really appreciated.
Thank you, Mohammed, for organizing this, and thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to present in your now famous series.
Thank you very much.
It's good to see all of you.
Yes.